Good day, everybody. Welcome to Groundwork, a new podcast from McLennan Corporation to talk about key material processing topics from agriculture to mining to material recycling. We'll discuss the best ways to process the raw materials that power the world because, as the saying goes, if it's not grown, it's mined. Hi, my name is Rick Madera. I'm the Senior Director of Sales here at McLennan Corporation. I've been with the company for, I think, it'll be 27 years here coming in March of this year. We've seen the industry change drastically over the years, and it continues to change. So I continue to learn. I come out of have an engineering degree out of Penn State. About 2 years after college, I decided to make a career change, and McLennan Corporation is local to me, and I came here with an opportunity, and I've been here ever since, and it's been an absolute blessing for me. It's a small industry that we serve, a lot of friends along the way, and I learned a lot. I continue to learn. So I'd like to introduce my co-host here, Alan. And Alan, if you want to say a couple of things about yourself.
Sure. I'm Alan Bennett. Been working with McClanahan for coming up on 7 years. I have a degree in metallurgical engineering from Montana Tech. I've been in this industry for quite a while, bouncing around different places. First part of my career was in the application side, working at different mine sites, copper, titanium, garnet, platinum, palladium, a lot of other things along the way. So I've worked with these pieces of equipment direct up front, as a frontline supervisor, as a plant manager type of approach. About 16 years ago, I switched over into looking at the supplying side of materials or the equipment itself, taking that application knowledge from the field and applying it to, working and sizing things up and trying to mix and match everything together. So just love this side of it. Gets me into, all different types of scenarios here and there. So been really enjoying being part of McClanahan. It's been a great journey. And like Rick, I enjoy learning more and more about things every time.
Yeah. And I think, being on the sales side of things, you and I talk, it's not daily. It seems like it's on a daily basis. Our paths cross a lot, and we certainly value the help we get from you and your group. And like I said before, we're talking a lot of different topics for this new podcast today. Our title is From Classic to Cutting Edge: The Evolution of Sand Washing and Classifying Equipment. So, 30 years ago, we processed sand a little differently, although a lot of it's still the same. But over the years, we've evolved into what we're calling new styles of processing equipment. But we'll talk a little bit. It might not be as new as what our industry thinks. But that certainly has changed and it's become more popular. So we think it's a good topic to talk about, how we process sand or I'll call it fine particles of all different industries. And one of the things, Alan, I guess that, I'll toss this question to you. Why do we even wash in the first place?
Well, a lot of it has to do with as we go along, and that's one of the reasons that a lot of this has changed over the years is, we used to just throw sand into different materials such as, concrete to make that or under the pack things. And as engineering comes along and looks for different things, we see different specifications required. Sometimes you have a little bit of, lignite or coal in the sand and you have to clean that up, or you want to get rid of some of the fines, or in other cases, you want to add fines. So there's a lot of different reasons that we wash, and it's really just to make the sand work best for the application we're putting it into.
Yeah, and it can get a little complicated because I've seen over the years that not only do we have to meet certain specifications depending what product you're making, different parts of our country have different specifications. One state might have certain specifications for concrete sand, where another state might be a little bit different. And even make it even a little worse is sometimes our customers are using their own product to make certain things, and they have certain specifications. And really, the only way to do that when you're starting to displace or starting to classify small particles is with water. So, like I said, I think it's a good topic for us to talk about here today. And one of the going back to my early days, and we talk about, and I don't know if this isn't an industry name. I don't think this is probably a Rick name or a McClanahan name, but we call it classic equipment. And what is classic equipment? Well, what I view classic equipment is kind of what the traditional sand washing was years ago, and still is today. Fine material screw washers, sand classifying tanks. They're all processing sand, and it goes down to coarse washing, coarse material screw washers and log washers, and that all for me falls under that umbrella of sand washing, classic washing, classic equipment used to wash sand. And in my opinion, they both have advantages and disadvantages, and the fact that people think screw washers are going away, they're not. We've manufactured more screw washers last year than we ever have in the company, and and the year before that was another record for screw washers. So they're not going away. And one of the reasons they're popular, in my opinion, and I've done talks about this in the past, is they're very flexible, very forgiving. You can feed them whatever you want, and you're probably going to get something come out the other end. And so I think producers still like that. They're relatively inexpensive. They're easy to use, and they're just widely accepted. If you're in this industry and you ever washed anything, chances are you've operated a fine material screw washer. One of the reasons I think that they can be unpopular, or where they take a bad rap, is they are flexible. You can feed them anything and you'll get a product out. But once you start doing that, they become very inefficient. When you're starting the expectations of a screw washer, when your expectation can see what their ability is that they can do. So they do have a disadvantage in that respect, that they can become inefficient if you're not operating the right way. And if you don't operate them the right way, they're still going to give you a product, where other equipment, that's not the case. So again, they're still a very popular piece of equipment. Producers love them. They're not going away. You talk about sand classifying tanks. I think sand classifying tanks there's a lot of equipment that can replace sand classifying tanks. And I know years ago now, and you'll talk about this here in a second, but years ago we used to put sand classifying tanks in just to scalp water, to handle water. There's much more efficient ways to do that these days, and less expensive. But what a sand classifying tank can do that other equipment can't do is if you have a you have a feed gradation, and if you have a belly, so you're missing something, you're deficient in the middle of that gradation. I'm not trying to get too far in the weeds here, too technical, but if you're deficient in that middle of your gradation, a sand tank can accommodate for that, because it can just put material where you want to put it, whether it's in your primary product or a waste product. It can do that sort of thing, where other equipment cannot do that. So I do think sand tanks won't go away. We manufacture just as many of those today as we've had years ago, and so I think that'll continue to happen. The disadvantage on a sand tank is that they're big, they're expensive, and what comes out the bottom of them has to be further dewatered. So there's other equipment that has to go around a sand tank. So it's important that you kind of evaluate, and we'll talk about this here in a little bit. You evaluate the application and make sure that we're putting the right equipment in for the right application. So again, that's kind of what I classify as classic equipment, and then you want to move forward. I don't have you talk a little bit about this as over the years. I guess I'll say it's becoming more popular of some of this new process equipment, or dewatering stream plants, or using cyclones and dewatering screens. If you could just talk a little bit about that.
Sure. I mean, I am I guess most people would call me a new equipment guy. I'm big into the cyclones, big into the dewatering screens, but exactly what you were saying, there's some equipment out there you just can't replace. Classifying tank, it does something nothing else does. So you're absolutely right. It's not going to be replaced by this new equipment. With that being said, the new equipment does things that the old equipment doesn't. They get a better efficiency, so you can get up with a little bit higher yield. But to call it new equipment is a little bit misleading. I mean, a cyclone itself, the first patent for a cyclone was back in 1891, and it's been progressing and getting more advanced over time period. Screens have been around forever and a day, but the dewatering screen itself was really created back in 1970 and used into coal. And that's also where cyclones got their first real big start was in coal back in 1939. Cyclones really didn't advance and get into a lot of other industries until like 1980. 1970, 1980, there was a lot of research done on these things. And that's why they're called new, is because they, truthfully, all of them are still progressing versus with the classic equipment. It's pretty set in stone. Yeah, you do a little bit different things with the classic equipment, but there's new advancements going on with this new equipment. And then you can add some other pieces of equipment into this range of new equipment, such as hydrocyzers or a subset, flat bottom classifiers. Attrition cells kind of get thrown in there because we're moving into harder and harder deposits, and we have to clean it up some more, and you get material sticking to material or staining or all sorts of other reasons that you'd have to use like an attrition scrub cell. So it is important to take a look to see which one fits for what applications. And I'll be the first one to say that, if you have an easy deposit, there's no reason not to use a lot of this classic equipment. But when you have a deposit that is a little more advanced, a little more difficult, a little more tricky, and you're trying to get a higher yield, there's an old saying, get more squeal out of the pig. This is what the newer equipment does, is you get more out of it. You increase your overall yield of your product. So you can make a tighter and tighter specification, or you can add more and more material that gets it on the borderline of the specifications that you're trying to get to. And who doesn't want a higher yield? So it's always kind of a balance between, what do I want? Do I want cheap, not cheap, less capital expenditure up front, a little bit less horsepower, all sorts of things, more simple with the classic equipment? Or do I need to go more complex with the newer equipment and the disadvantages that come along with it? Because they generally do take higher horsepower, because you got pumping that goes along with it. Cyclone itself doesn't have any motors, but you're going to need a pump that needs a motor on it. Dewatering screens. So you do have a different type of electrical layout, different type of layout in general. They generally use less space. A hydrocyclone is going to take up a whole lot less space than a screw. But the big advantage of a screw is a guy can walk up to it and he can see exactly what's going on, versus a cyclone. It's up in the air most of the time, and you just have to trust it and look for the signs and figure out, from outside of the cyclone how it's performing. While a screw, you can sit there and take a look at it directly. You have to have a little bit more of a practiced eye when it comes to a lot of this newer equipment in order to do something like that.
Yeah, and I can remember, Alan, back, when I started in the industry, we didn't have this type of equipment, and after about 2 years of me being with the company, so 25 years ago, 23 years ago, we purchased a company that has all that I call process equipment, cyclones, dewatering screens, hydrocyzers, that sort of thing. And we kept the product line separate back then. So I would actually compete against that equipment, and I would win all the time. It was so easy selling a screw washer versus other stuff, but that has certainly changed. Now it's obviously all one big product line for us now, and that has certainly changed over the years as far as what's favored. But can you touch base? And we're one of the. I know there's a couple manufacturers have these, but not all. But just touch a couple minutes on the difference. And when I look at a hydrocyclone or a cyclone and a separator, to me, I see the exact same thing, but they are different. Can you just touch a little bit on that? Because I'm sure our viewers have seen both and don't realize there's some key differences.
Oh yeah, the cyclone is the traditional thing. It's been around for quite some time. Although technically speaking, the current separator is very similar to one of the classic hydrocyzers, because the original hydrocyclones did not necessarily use an air core. And that's one of the big differences, is how you do a lift separation. And they would plug it up. And they got away from that because they saw a change by introducing an air core. When I talk about air core, that means allowing air to go up through the bottom of the cyclone. And the air will carry the light material and the water into the overflow. Without that, your separation efficiency goes down quite a bit. Back in the, I would say like late 80s came along the idea of the separator. And what that was is it actually is going back to originally how a hydrocyclone was set up by closing off the bottom of it. And instead of an air core lifting the water out, you have a siphon effect. So the water starts going into the overflow pipe, and that creates the lift and the separation. And so the easiest way to tell the difference between a hydrocyclone and a separator is the underflow regulator. A lot of people call it fishtail. Some I've heard it called a duckbill. I get a lot of different names go out there for this, but underflow regulator, it looks kind of like a mud flap on the bottom of the cyclone. And it separates out. And while it doesn't have enough solids built up into the cyclone itself, it stays closed. And that diminishes the amount of water in the underflow. The other big thing that you can tell about for a separator versus a cyclone is the overflow pipe. A separator has to have an overflow pipe that, gets called a candy cane because that's what it really looks like. It's a big, long overflow pipe, and that's one of the disadvantages of the separator is it does have a higher install footprint than a cyclone. So if you see a separator and a cyclone, you're going to notice some very visual differences. But in truth, once you get past those visual differences, they perform very, very similar in the separation, and they have similar separation efficiencies. Just the separator is going to have a higher amount of water taken out of it. And that's where the name actually came from. You're separating the water from the solids.
And I saw, we don't a much more, advanced plant at times will utilize hydrocyzers. And just touch base a little bit on your thoughts on hydrocyzers and where they fit in. I know I would say they're not as popular, certainly not as popular as what we'll call a dewatering stream plant or screw washers, for that fine material screw washer for that matter. But why would somebody want to consider a hydrocyzer?
There's a hydrocyzer acts very similar in ways to a classifying tank, using settling to change things out. The difference is a hydrocyzer uses more updraft water called teeter water, and it gets involved versus a free settling, which is what a classifying tank is. It's called hindered settling, and the material itself kind of acts as a fluid screen. And of all the wet classifying equipment, a hydrocyzer is the most efficient, a little bit below what a screen is. Screen efficiency can be up in the 95% efficiency, separating what you want. A hydrocyzer, not quite up there. It can be up into the 80s, but it's better than a cyclone, better than any other type of free settling classifier. So it provides a better, sharper cut. Another big thing that a hydrocyzer can do, and this is where we get into the subset called flat bottom classifiers, is if you have light contaminants, organics, coal, lignite in your sand, and when you make concrete with sand that has lignite in it, it creates spaces and makes a weaker concrete. So you need to get that out. And usually it's done by a color test. So you look to see how much sand versus coal just by a visual aspect of it. But a hydrocyzer does a fantastic job of removing that coal. And the flat bottom classifier is even more specialized at that just because of the higher amount of water distribution. So the reason to go to a hydrocyzer is you're trying to make a sharper cut, goes back to yield. I want more of my good stuff going in the right direction. Or if you're trying to get rid of some light contaminants, it does, the best job out there. I've seen people try to do it with screws. I've seen people try to do it with sand tanks. It just doesn't quite do the job.
No, it doesn't. And I think one of the reasons you see hydrocyzers pretty popular in the mining industry as opposed to the aggregate industry is just every ounce of material matters in the mining industry, especially if you're making a really expensive product and you have to hit certain specifications, right? And so you do see them more popular. We have a few plants in the aggregate industry that are using hydrocyzers successfully. and those producers would not veer from them for because of the product that it gives them. So you're right; they're very, very, very efficient. I can remember, back whenever we combine product lines. When I say combined product lines, I'm talking classic equipment and this what I call wet process equipment, cyclones and dewatering screens and hydrocisers. I can remember, and this will kind of lead into attrition cells, but I can remember going into a plant, and this was out in California, where they would literally have 3 screw washers lined up feeding each other. And, you can, the reason they were doing that, and we call it a triple wash, is getting washed 3 times. But the reason they were doing that is they were out in California. They have some sand equivalency specifications, the SC specifications they have to meet, and they have issues with it out there because of the clay that's in with the sand. And we tried everything. We were putting little fins on the back of the screw flights and screw washers to try to clean this stuff up. And so what we did, and we kind of took a chance. We put a dewatering screen after one of the screw washers, and we had just enough material. It went through the screen, as you know how they operate, and get pumped up to a cyclone to recirculate that. It was scrubbing that, just going through the cyclone, the pump, it was scrubbing enough sand to get their SCs up to where they needed to be. So that, for me, really became popular, running screw washers after, or running dewatering screens after screw washers, just for that reason. And you got a drier product. There was a lot of advantages around that. And again, this was probably, I think, I don't know, I put my first one in back 20 some years ago. And, but a lot of, they still were a firm believer using screw washers, and they were a firm believer using several of them until we convinced them just to take the other 2 screw washers out, use the one screw washer and feeding dewatering screen, and it got them where they needed to be. It became very popular out there, cleaning up their sand. But if you really have, just while we're talking about sand processing, if you really have a difficulty cleaning up your sand, I think attrition cells, and I'll get your comments on this, is probably the only way to go to scrub sand, correct?
Well, I've always kind of put it in this range. If you need a light scrub, a pump and a cyclone will do a light scrub. If you want a medium scrub, a fine material washer run correctly, it will give you a good medium scrub. But then when you get into, I need a heavy duty scrub, I have particles sticking together that even a screw doesn't get off, that's when you move into the attrition scrub. And it's all about particle on particle interaction. And that's why the dewatering screen does that, because you get a lot of particle interaction on a dewatering screen. And then the rinse afterwards gets rid of that material. So a lot of times you have to hit it in a couple of different ways. And that's another reason to go with a mixing and matching of the new and the classic equipment. Is one thing will do one way, and then you hit it a different way and you get a little bit different results. So yeah, definitely an attrition scrub cell is the heavy duty one. The biggest thing that you have to remember about the attrition scrub cell is it's not going to remove any of those fine particles or anything like that. You have to have a washing afterwards. A screw is a fantastic thing to have after a attrition scrub cell. So's a cyclone. Both of them do a real good job of removing that finer material that you wanted to get rid of in the first place.
And how, and you're feeding these attrition cells fairly dense. I mean, I know it's a slurry, but it what are we feeding it? It's 60% solid, 70% solid, something like that?
Most attrition scrub cells work best at 70. If you can get it up to 80, it works really well, but that's a compromise on the motor. The drier it is, the less water there is to lubricate it, the more horsepower you're going to need. So if you can scrub it at 80%, you're going to get a really fantastic scrub, and actually maybe too much of a scrub. So 70 has been really a good area to work at. And the 2 best pieces of equipment to get your slurry at 70% or higher, it's actually better to come in a little bit higher. You can use a separator, which is going to discharge your material in the range of 70 to 75. And then you have your dewatering screen. It's going to discharge the material anywhere between, 20% moisture all the way down to, best we've ever seen is 7, but more realistically in the 10 to 12 range. So getting it into the 80% solids from a dewatering screen, you're going to set yourself up real well for an attrition scrub cell, because then you can dilute it down and control it at that point. But if you have the feed going into your attrition scrub cell at 60%, there's no way you're going to get it drier. You're not going to be able to remove any moisture at that point. So it's really better to go overboard of drying the material up, getting more moisture out before you go into the scrub cell. And then you can add water based upon your amp draws, and you can maximize that performance.
Yeah, and that's why it's so important, and we really encourage our customers, and no matter who they're working with, to get your material tested. And most of these manufacturers will have labs, and they can test the material, and they can make recommendations. It's really important, because if your product's not clean enough or it's not meeting spec, it doesn't matter what equipment you put in there. So I encourage people to work with their whoever they're working with, and get recommendations based off of testing or prior experience. I had a customer call me. This was probably 2 weeks ago. Wanted to talk about a sand classifying tank. They had one. It was old. They wanted to replace it. It was one of ours, and he was telling me about, he only had one dewatering piece of equipment underneath the sand tank, because everything that came out of the bottom of the sand tank he put into this, and I think it was a screw washer. He put in the screw washer, and then I was confused by that, because a sand classifying tank is supposed to have a waste product and a good product, and the whole reason behind that is that you're not using all the material. And he said, "Oh no, my material's in spec. I just have too much water coming in, and I needed." And that back then, that they were actually called water scalping tanks. I think a manufacturer used to call them. And I told him there's other ways of doing that, and one of the ways is putting a cyclone or something. I had to take care of that water, and then just putting whatever comes out on the cyclone either into a dewatering screen or into a screw washer. Ultimately, he's going to go see a couple sites that they're doing this very thing. But I get a lot of requests, and we have a lot of equipment out there that's doing that sort of thing, handling water, and at high rates. And giving you a product that you can manage that with some much smaller piece of, whether it's a fine material screw washer or dewatering screens, that's just handling those, I'll call it dewatered slurry, if you will. You have some experience with that?
Yeah, I haven't been to a mine site, no matter what the material is, where water was not a major concern, whether it's too much or too little. And so there's always methods of trying to either reclaim water because you have too little, because of, you live in an area that doesn't have a lot of water, so you need every little bit that you can get, or you have too much water and it's going all over the place. The equipment gets too big. You have too much water going into a sand classifying tank. That's problems, because you're not getting the settling. You have too much water going into a screw, you're going to be washing material over the backside of it. So, adding in a cyclone in front of either one of those things, even if you're not really using the full potential of the cyclone or the separator, and you're just using it to get rid of water, scalp off some water, major advantage in that, because if you do diminish the amount of water, and then you can size your piece of equipment for the tons per hour versus your entire flow rate. So yeah, it's an important thing. And we do take quite a bit of a look at water management. We always do a material bounce whenever we do these type of things. And we look at where the water is coming from, how much water, makeup water is required, or the wastewater. And we have other pieces of equipment, and we're not going to be talking about it here, but they deal with the water when you have too much of it, or if you're trying to reclaim get the water back into the system. You have processed water. You just have to worry about the fines being carried over if you're using a lot of recycled water within the system. So that's another side of it, is make sure that you're cleaning up the water enough to maintain your system.
Yeah, and you nailed it, Alan. That waters have been such a topic over the last 10 years. It's a premium for sure, and that's a big concern for most customers, as it should be. So how you handle the water, is important, and I'm sure we'll have a topic on that at some point on one of these podcasts. I have no doubt. But the other thing I'm seeing really growing popularity, and again, I'm talking about a sand classifying tank if it's put in and because it's needed. Is the sand classifying tank discharges at about whatever 40% solids, 30% solids, so it's very wet. That has to be dewatered. Traditionally, that went into a screw washer, and they still do. But more and more, I'm seeing these things go into I'll call them dewatering screen plants. I'm just seeing that more and more now to dewater that material. Why do you think that is?
Well, a lot of it is, to put it in a pretty blunt term, is impatience. You take it into a fine material washer screw, and that material has to sit around, because you can put the discharge of a screw onto a conveyor and make a stockpile from it. But that material is going to be sitting there for 2 or 3 days. And if you run it across a dewatering screen, you drop that onto a conveyor belt, you can actually be loading a truck out the very same day off of you get a little bit of a different technique of, taking the material out of the stockpile. What happens a lot of times is, there's stockpiles going out there. You're putting on it right there. You're pulling out of it, putting it in a truck the very day. The front end loaders are topping off the stockpile. So they're getting the drier material that comes off the top. And there's that base down on the bottom that still has a lot of water in it. But yeah, it's all about getting the material out as fast as possible in a lot of cases. The other side of it is, one of the disadvantages I've always seen of some of the classic equipment, especially the screw, is people look at them and say, I just put more streams into it. And they don't really take into account for the amount of water going into there. And they end up losing material over the backside that they shouldn't have been losing. With a dewatering screen, the material that you lose is usually the material you don't want in the first place. So it cleans it up also. I mean, a screw definitely cleans it up also, but it retains, if you get it in spec coming from the sand classifying tank and you put it on a dewatering screen, you're not going to lose any of your good material. So it's another part of the yield side of things is I want more of my material going where I want it to go.
Yeah, that's a great point, and you're right. And with the dewatering screen, everything, even the stuff that goes through the screen, we recirculate that, so we don't lose good material. I can remember watching haul trucks drive down the road with just slurry, wet water coming out the back of it because his stuff was so wet because they were trying to load them too quick. And there's no question that there's an advantage. A dewatering screen has an advantage over fine material screw washer when it comes to the product and how wet it is. There's no question. I don't think anyone would debate that. I can debate other things, but I don't think anyone would ever debate that. It will give you a much drier product pretty consistently, depending on what they're making. And I have a picture of we did a plant where they had a sand tank. One side was going into a screw washer. I think it was called I'll call it their B product, and their A product was going onto a dewatering screen. And there's pictures of these stockpiles sitting next to each other, and man, you can really appreciate what a dewatering screen does when you look at this picture. And like I said, it's not. And I can say it's probably across the board manufacturers. You're definitely going to get a drier product. And I will say there's some concerns with the screen going into sand tank. Sand tanks will discharge at a very unstable rate. Like you might have a slug of material come flying down, and you might have somewhere not a lot's coming down. It just depends how often the sand's settling out and what plungers are opening. A screw washer can always handle that. It can handle those slugs, and sometimes at dewatering screen you got to do some special things up front to make sure it can handle that, or just make sure you're adjusting your valve station so they're coming out a little bit more consistently. Which again, work with your manufacturer to look at all of that. And the other thing you said that I really a good key point is, and I mentioned earlier, people were just feeding screw washers as long as something coming out the discharge end, they're happy. It's a product, they're happy, but I encourage those producers to always periodically test what's going into their overflow, because like you said, 9 times out of 10, when you start feeding too much, they're having good product go out the overflow. And that can lead into a lot of other problems. You want good material going where it needs to go, because you're sending bad material probably to a pond, and there's other ways to handle it, obviously water, but probably to a pond that you're having somebody have to dig out. So it's costing you. You're losing the money of not being able to sell the product, and you're losing money because you got to clean it back up. So it's encouraged. We really encourage our customers to test, not only there, but all aspects of your plant. You should be looking at those sorts of things for sure.
You hit a real good point there.
Go ahead, Alan.
Rick,
Sorry.
About the finer material. And that's one thing, like a lot of the classic equipment can't handle that finer material. And, a hydrocyclone is going to go all the way down to 400 mesh, real small material. It's powder. So you're going to be able to capture a lot of that waste material that you couldn't capture, that you don't have to go out to a pond, and you can put it into an area that you can handle it better. So that digging out of ponds kind of can go away if you use the proper equipment going on there. Another point that you brought up was the stockpiles, the difference of the stockpiles. A drier stockpile stacks taller, so you use less room. I don't know if everybody had that in their mind when you said the exact same thing, but you can get more material on the same plot of land with the drier it is. So that's the other advantage of using that dewatering screen.
Yeah, and the other thing I totally forgot to mention, and you look at you mentioned finer material. Screw washers, we rate their screw shaft speed based on how fine the product is they're producing. And this is an industry role. This isn't a McClanahan role. This is an industry role. So it's basically you look at the product they're making, and we look at what's passing a 50 mesh. And if it's fine, if there's a lot of stuff passing a 50 mesh, all manufacturers will derate their screw washer, sometimes as much as 25% screw shaft speed. So whenever you do that, you're derating your capacity by 75%. So you might want to process 100 tons an hour, but you have to buy a screw washer that can handle 500 tons an hour. So you're buying a big piece of equipment that's not needed. So again, all these things need to be looked at, from whoever you're working with, from manufacturer or the technical team can help the producer look at these things and make sure they're getting the right piece of equipment. How do you? I know there's one of the things that we're accomplishing these days too are some of these sand plants, and I'll call them dewatering screen plants. That are making two products. Can you just run through how we're able to do that with dewatering screens and not with sand classifying tanks?
Yeah, I mean, truthfully, what's happening is you have two different streams coming in, or you're ending up with two pumps and two cyclones in the same system, and you're utilizing the same dewatering screen. So what happens? And the most common one that we see here in North America is you have a main stream coming in, heavy stream, and you run it through the cyclone, and the underflow from the dewatering screen then goes to another pump, and then it's pumped up to another cyclone, and the dewatering screen has a split down the middle of it. And so you have in most cases a C33 sand on one side, and then on the other side you have the finer material, which usually qualifies as a mason sand. And in truth, you're hitting it you are making two different products from the same stream, but you're hitting it two different times. And that's the difference between the sand classifying tank is you only hitting it with one time. You have the material coming in, and then you have the different stations setting the material in the different areas. So it can be accomplished, but it gets a little more complex. But with the finer material, I think it's a little bit easier to make a masonry sand with that two-product sand plant, dewatering screen sand plant, than it is with a classifying tank. But I know it's very possible either way. But when you're dealing with a classifying tank, you probably still have to have a dewatering screen to handle that masonry sand, because the fine material washer won't do it.
Right. Yeah, I couldn't agree more, and like I think that's one of the reasons we're seeing that just become more and more popular, and especially with our I'll call them sand plants that they're quoting that we're putting dewatering screen plants in there as opposed to screw washers. Now they are more expensive to do that, but the trade-off is worth it. And again, we're fortunate we can provide both, so we can look at both. But there are some advantages and disadvantages to both ways. But I would agree, especially on the finer sand, that the watering screen is a much better option for a lot of reasons. Are you seeing? When I talk about these, I'll call them sand plants that are making two products. Is it just as basic as making? They're making. Can they make I'll call it a fine product and a coarse product, and then blend what they need to blend to make whatever product they need to make? Is that being done out there too?
Well, I know we set it up to do that way, and we do that with the discharge chute on the end of it, since it is coming off the same screen. We have the split going down the screen, and then we have, arms that will reach into one or the other. And generally speaking, you always want to have 100%. You don't necessarily want to send any coarse into your fine material. I guess there are some cases, but there are possibilities where you want to send 100% of your fine material into your coarse side. So that's the way we set up our gates. Is you can change that so everything goes into one side, and then move the gate on there to dictate how much fine material you want to go to the fine side. So yeah, you're running down there, you can make a real clean coarse material and then blend in your finer material to, once again, get the highest amount of yield. And that requires the individual site to do a lot of testing to make sure they stay in spec, because they end up riding the edge on that. They're trying to get the most out of their fine material as they can while staying in spec. And it's a great approach, but it also requires a little bit more attention to make sure that you're not overdoing the fines. So yeah, we've been doing that for I don't know how many years. I believe we really pioneered splitting the deck on the dewatering screen and then capturing the most material going one way or the other.
Yeah, I would agree. So if I'm a producer and I come to you and I tell you I want to process some sand, a sand slurry, what information do you need from me?
Well, first thing I'd ask for is a couple of different things. Is one, how much are you talking about? The tons per hour. I'd want to see a gradation, and then I'd also want to see your water. What availability of water do you have to do? Are you tight with water, or do you have to keep water? You're not allowed to release water, so you have to retain all of it in as possible, or you have these big ponds, which are fantastic. I mean, if you have a big pond, it's great. But not everybody has that. So I need to know a lot of the considerations around it, not just I want to make sand. I want to know what type of sand it is. I want to know how much sand you have, what spec you want to make, and then your water conditions, because that's all. When it comes to wet processing, water's by far one of the strongest things to design around.
Yeah, well, yeah, and again, because this equipment, different type of processes take different amount of water to process it. So it's important. It's a good point. If you don't have enough water to use a cyclone, then there's no sense in talking about cyclones. And
hydrosizers use a ton of water. So
right. Yeah. So and all that stuff has to be considered and talked about, and that's why I really think at the end of the day, when you're talking about do I use again classic equipment, traditional sand washing equipment, or do I use again quoting the new style equipment, which is not new, and there's a lot of manufacturers coming into play with these dewatering screen plants and things. When somebody asks me which one do I recommend, and I there's two ways sometimes to process a material, and I get either or be work. It might just come down to preference. It might come down to comfortability. But I'm also a strong believer there's a lot of times where one choice is better than the others, and there is a reason why we select certain things. And even though they both might do the same thing.
Well, you get three process engineers in a room, and you'll have 5 different opinions on how to do the process. So
that's true.
You're absolutely true, right. There's a lot of different ways of doing it.
Yeah, and again, I think there are a lot of them are all effective, and I've had customers make their choice just because they're comfortable. They're more comfortable operating a screw washer than something else, and that's fine. And we just outline the advantages and disadvantages of each, and we work with them to make it operate as efficiently as possible.
There's a lot to be said about being comfortable with the equipment.
Sure.
Because if you're comfortable with it, you're going to be able to get more out of it. So, if a person is much more comfortable with screws and they're trying to change and they're going to put in a cyclone in place of that, but they have no idea about the cyclone, they're not comfortable with it, chances are they'll probably outperform with the screw, even if it is a better technical approach. So yeah, it is important about the comfortable aspect of what you're doing.
And I guess, so Alan, do you kind of look at, when you're looking at the customer's application, do you have any idea going in what which way you're leaning towards, where classic versus new, or is it more of a conversation to see what they're wrapped around and maybe what they're interested in?
Well, I know I always kind of lean towards the new equipment, but I have learned over the time, being in this industry for a number of years, I've started off asking the question, what have you done in the past? Has it worked for you? Do you want to keep doing it? Do you want to try something new? And if they want to try something new, try to, give them as much comfortable knowledge about that new so they can do it properly. I've seen some real old hands try to do a new piece of equipment, and, I get on site to help them out. It's like, you better take that home in your suitcase because it's not staying here.
Yeah. Yeah, all good points, Alan. And one of the things that, even just a couple takeaways for me, key points I want to hit on is we said it several times, and you brought up beginning of your discussion is that, this new equipment isn't new. It's been around for a long time, and it got a bad rap early in the days because producers and manufacturers didn't know that equipment well enough, and we weren't operating it the right way, and when you don't operate in the right way or size in the right way, it gives them fits. And I think as an industry, we've overcome that over the last, I'll call it 15 years. And it's really, I'd say we're offering up this new equipment just as much as we are the classic equipment. And the other key point for me today is the thought that this classic or traditional sand washing equipment is going away. It's not. We're doing more and more every year, and it's going to be around for a long, long time. And again, several manufacturers have that equipment as well, and I don't think it's going away. I think there's going to be a need for that, at least for my lifetime anyway. And we'll see what happens after that. But do you have any other closing comments, Alan?
Well, you hit the nail right on the head about this isn't going. The classic equipment's not going away. I've seen manufacturers who are the cutting edge, and all of a sudden they're bringing in some of this classic equipment. Right. And to me, it's just a level of arrogance thinking that the new is always better. And I've seen time and time again, if something works, don't get rid of it. But at the same time, look to see how you can improve it. And that's how you start mixing all this classic equipment and the new equipment is what makes sense for the site, what makes sense. And, looked at a couple of different levels, capital investment, yield. It's not simple, straightforward. And that's one of the advantages I think we have is we come at it. We have long history with both sides of this equipment, especially since we merged the product lines together. And it can create a much better solution in hitting things the way they need to be hit at the time they need to be hit like that. So it's just an all-around benefit.
I would agree. For the folks tuning in, thanks for listening to Groundwork, McClanahan podcast. Be sure to follow us on social media for updates and more content. And I'm sure we'll see you around. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.